Good evening. We're going to go ahead and get started. We may have a few more people trickle in, so we're just going to stay on our schedule here. Well, I'm Sarah Suggs, and I have the privilege of serving as the president and CEO of the Sandra O'Connor Institute. And on behalf of Justice O'Connor and our board of directors, I'd like to welcome you this evening to our launch of the Millennial Council for the Institute. This morning, I had the honor of being with Justice O'Connor to brief her about this initiative. She's well aware of it. She knows you're gathering tonight, and she is so pleased to know that we have you in attendance, that you're interested in civic engagement, and she considers this initiative very important to the vision and the future of the O'Connor Institute. So we want to thank you and welcome you for being with us. I can also tell you from personal experience going back to the late 80s and early 1990s that we are honored and you are privileged to be and hear from one of the most knowledgeable individuals in the state of Arizona, both on our state and the legislative process. I'm going to let our MC share with you some of his history and background, but we are really thrilled to have him. And in fact, most recently, he's been nominated and elected to the board of directors of the Sandra O'Connor Institute. So we're very pleased to have Chris' vision and leadership join our organization. Finally, tonight is made possible through a generous grant of the Virginia M. Ullman Foundation. And we want to extend our appreciation to the foundation for making this happen and possible for all of us. And now, I have the honor and privilege of introducing our MC. Lauren Gilger is an award-winning journalist whose work has impacted communities large and small, exposing injustices and giving a voice to the voiceless and marginalized. She received her undergraduate degree from Fordham University in New York City, and after earning her master's degree in broadcast journalism from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication in 2011, where she was named Outstanding Graduate Student. She worked as an investigative producer and reporter for ABC 15 News in Phoenix. Lauren, in 2013, was the recipient of the prestigious George Foster Peabody Award and the Edward R. Murrow Award for her work that forced one of the world's largest automakers to recall more than 700,000 SUVs. Nationally, her work has appeared in the Washington Post and ABC's Nightline. Currently, Lauren is a producer and host for the National Public Radio Phoenix affiliate KJZZ. Please welcome tonight's MC, Lauren Gilger.
I always have to lower these. Well, thanks for coming. I'm really happy to be here to host you guys tonight. Like she said, I am a journalist. I'm one of the hosts of the show on KJZZ. It's our daily magazine show, 9 to 11, tune in. So I just wanted to give you a brief introduction about why we're here. So the O'Connor Institute is a nonpartisan organization that's dedicated to civil discussion, and that hopefully can lead to civic engagement. And the Millennial Council just began last fall, and their goal is to get people of our generation. I recently learned I am a millennial. I didn't really realize that. And we want to get involved in these discussions. So first I want to introduce your Millennial Council to you. I think they're all sitting in front here, but give a little wave or something. Michaela Colby, Sarah Delaney, Claire Eichman, Maureen Feeney, Julia Garcia, Jonathan Gilbart, Jacob Hammond, and Caitlin Waters. So thanks to all of them. A little round of applause. So tonight we're going to get a crash course in how to become civically engaged. What does that mean? And here to take us beyond the Schoolhouse Rock version of that is Chris Herstam. Chris is what we call on the show one of our political experts. He's on often to give us expert opinions on what's happening at the state legislature. In his career, he's been a leader in the state legislature himself. He was the president of the Board of Regents, and he was the chief of staff to Governor Fife Symington. He also chaired the transition for Governor Janet Napolitano. And now Chris is a principal at Lewis and Roca here in town. He is the chairman of the Arizona Government Relations practice there. So Chris, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at this kickoff event for the Millennial Council. It's exciting, and we appreciate you being here. They asked me to come here and to make this presentation basically because the council that asked me to come, they heard me give the presentation, and they thought maybe you would enjoy it as well. I am at a dangerous point in my career, I just warn you. When you're a couple of years away from retirement, frankly, you get to a point where you don't give a damn anymore. And you just sort of tell it like you see it. And so that's what I'm going to do. It's called, I titled it myself, it's an Arizona political reality check. I consider it nonpartisan. I consider it non-ideological, but it's guaranteed to offend everyone in the room. So let's get started. It's just the way I see it, and there will be lots of time for you to give your opinions and ask any questions and challenge me in any way you want to when I'm done. And I love that part. So it's just the way I see it after spending over 30 years at the state capitol. And I grew up here in Arizona. My family moved here in 1958. I'm a public education graduate, Madison Elementary Schools, Camelback High School, and Arizona State University. So that's where I come from. I was a registered Republican for most of my adult life, but a couple of years ago I switched parties. I'm now a registered Democrat. So anyway, let's get going, because there's a lot to be said. Arizona is unique in many regards. Millennials. This is really the coming of age for millennials. They're the future, but they're also the present, because as it says up there on the screen, in 2020, the next presidential election, for the first time, millennials will exceed the baby boomers as a percentage of eligible voters. And this is not a group that politicians are going to want to lose. This is really a fascinating statement about 2020. You know, I'm a baby boomer, but it's obvious that we baby boomers are fading away. And you folks are really just coming into your own. And that millennial generation that you belong to, which is now over 75 million folks that are in the 18 to 34-year-old generation. In fact, that's the latest, by the way, census statistics from April of 2016. Some research says that we're now, the millennials, are over 80 million. But clearly you have now in numbers surpassed the baby boomer generation. However, the millennial viewpoint on public policy and on politics is very different than baby boomers. Let me give you some examples. When it comes to the job approval rating of Donald Trump, President Trump, as of a couple of weeks ago, you can see the difference. Only 24% of the millennials approved of his job performance thus far. Baby boomers, 52%. Quite a difference. When it comes to the temporary travel ban, or as some people call it, the Muslim ban, 31% of millennials believe it's necessary. Look at the number for baby boomers, 54%. Quite a difference in viewpoint between the two generations. When you look at Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, was it a good idea or not? 48% of millennials say yes. Only 37% of the baby boomers say yes. And when it comes to foreign trade and trade pacts such as NAFTA, have they helped us or hurt us? Quite a disparity here. 50% of the millennials say they've helped us. Only 32% of the baby boomers say they have. So a tremendous difference in opinion. And so as the baby boomers pass on over time, hey, I'm 67, I know it's gonna happen, right? As that happens, and the millennials become more of a percentage of the folks that are voting and turning out, you can see there's a difference in viewpoint on many of the current day issues. Will the millennials continue to maintain this ideological or philosophical viewpoint on these issues as they get older? Who knows? But by then, there will be a new generation coming up that will maybe have a different viewpoint. But it's fascinating to watch, and it'll be interesting to see how it affects the political world nationally and here in Arizona. I know that many of you, probably the majority of you, consider politics a dirty word these days. But the reality is you can't get away from politics. It permeates every aspect of our society, including the Arizona Legislature and statewide offices and Arizona public policy. When you take political science courses these days, they tell you that politics concerns the exercise of power in society or in specific decisions over public policy. Politics is about power, values, and influence in society. It's about who gets what, when, and how. And politics is one reason why it's so terribly difficult to analyze public policy. The two political parties, I know there's libertarians and there's the Green Party, but they are very tiny in numbers. The two political parties still run the political process nationally and especially here in Arizona. When I took political science courses way back at ASU, decades ago, they taught us that there was really only one reason for a political party to exist. And that reason was to win elections. And the only way parties could win elections was to maintain the big tent theory. And that big tent theory basically was get as many people with divergent views into your party, under your tent, and that was the way you won elections. Let me give you an example of an issue. Let's take a non-controversial issue. How about abortion? In the old days, actually about 20 years ago, you had, let's take one party, the Republican Party, you had pro-life individuals active in the Republican Party, and you had pro-choice individuals. The same was true in the Democratic Party. When I served in the legislature in the 80s, the minority leader that was a minority leader for 25 years at the Arizona House, great guy named Art Hamilton, he was a Democratic minority leader. He was pro-life. You had a lot of pro-lifers in the Democratic Party as well. And so issues that were what we think as controversial, they were not as party, there was not party polarization like there is today. Flash forward to today. If you're a Republican and you want to win a Republican primary for almost any office in the state of Arizona, you better be pro-life. Pro-choice Republicans have very little chance of success in Republican primaries. If you're a Democrat on the abortion issue, you better be pro-choice. Pro-life Democrats, their chances in Democratic primaries are very, very slim. That's just the reality. And when you go through issue after issue, like, for instance, gun control, etc., you're going to find that today the political parties are not big tents. They're pup tents. There's a litmus test. Some people think that's good. They think that the parties today stand for a definitive philosophy or ideology, and that's the way it should be. But let me tell you how it's impacted the political process. Because years ago, and once again, I go back to those poli-sci classes that I took, they said politics was the art of compromise. Not anymore. Because of the polarization of the parties, compromise is often a dirty word. And when you've got two parties in a political process and neither one is willing to compromise, you aren't going to solve many problems. It's really tough to pass legislation. And I still believe the majority of the voters in our state, at least here in Arizona, they're really not that enamored with ideologically driven politicians. They just want their problems in their state solved. And that's really hard to do now, because to win primaries and get reelected, which politicians, unfortunately, too many of them, that's their number one concern, they've got to toe the line in their party. They've got to meet that litmus test. They can't afford to play footsie with the other party and come together, build consensus, compromise on complicated problems facing our state, and solve them. That's the political reality that we're living with. And certainly, that's what we see nationally as well. Now, in both states, both Arizona and nationally, we basically now have a one-party rule. So it will be easier, supposedly, for them to pass legislation and to get their way. But when we had Congress run by Republicans and a Democratic president for 8 years, we saw how that polarization worked. Very little could get done, and very little, frankly, took place to solve problems. Very frustrating to the average voter, but it's the reality that exists today. So, how are Arizonans registered to vote? Which parties are they choosing? This slide it looks boring, I know. It's really fascinating. And let me tell you why it's fascinating. You see that 34.5% of our registered voters right now in Arizona, according to the Secretary of State's office, are Republican. 30.3% are Democrats. 34% have decided they didn't want to belong when they registered to either party. Let me tell you why these numbers are fascinating. Because I want to give you the numbers for just 17 years ago, the year 2000. Guess what these numbers were? For Republicans, in 2000, 43% were Republicans. So they've lost 8.5%. The Democrats in the year 2000 were at 38%. So they've lost 7.5%. The independents, well, guess what they were? They were only 17%. They have doubled. 17% increase. And this is going to continue. This is a trend nationally and here in Arizona. I bet you in 10 years that 34% will be 45%. But there's a problem. I respect the fact that people are turned off by those polarized, ideologically driven parties. But there's a big problem here in Arizona. Independents basically cannot run for office. They're disenfranchised unless they're filthy rich. There's many statutory requirements that the two parties have put into place in Arizona that do not create a level playing field for candidates. Let me give you just one example. The first thing you have to do to get on the ballot is get petition signatures. You need a certain formula-driven percentage number of signatures if you want to run for office. Let's say you want to run for statewide office in the past election, 2016. You wanted to run maybe for Secretary of State. If you were a Republican, you would have to have gotten 5,800, I'm rounding them off, 5,800 signatures just to get on the ballot. That's the first thing you got to do. Because there's less Democrats. If you were a Democrat, by statute, you would have had to have gotten 5,300 signatures. But I bet you that more than a third of you in this room are neither right now. And if you wanted to run for Secretary of State, you know how many signatures you would have had to have gotten? 35,000 signatures. 35,000 compared to 5,800 and 5,300. It's stacked against the independents. Why? Because those party candidates don't want any stinking independent running against them in the general election. Many of them are in, when you get to the legislative level, they're in safe districts, so all they have to do is get through the primary. and then they're home free because it's a safe Republican or Democratic district. Well, the problem is, that's a problem in itself, it's not fair, but what's really a problem is when that independent number gets into the 40s and 45 and maybe approaches 50%, that's an enormous number of our voters. And if the statutes aren't changed and a level playing field is not created, that's a huge pool of registered voters that we're not going to ever have running for office. And you're going to continue to get those party-oriented, polarized folks as the only ones realistically that can run for office. Only independent millionaires that can afford to hire people to get that massive amount of signatures are going to be able to afford to run for office. That's the political reality that I see. And how will you change it? The parties aren't going to change it at the legislature. The best way of changing it is using our Constitution and getting an initiative put on the ballot that would create a level playing field. But what's happening right now this week at the legislature? They're passing legislation, frankly, to make it far more difficult to get initiatives on the ballot. This is, I could talk about this, don't worry, I won't, for 2 hours, and you still wouldn't understand it. I have trouble understanding this. Thanks to the US Supreme Court in 2010, in Citizens United and a couple of subsequent cases, the Supreme Court ruled that corporations are people. And you can't deprive corporations, you can't put a limit on them contributing to independent expenditures and participating in campaigns. We have a constitution in this state that bans corporate contributions of any kind. The majority of the states do. But that those Supreme Court decisions took that away from us. It superseded the state constitution. And now corporate contributions are legal with regards to independent expenditures. And what we've seen is a massive amount of corporate money into the political system, also impacting unions as well. They have more power to do that. But here in Arizona, it's been corporate contributions and very wealthy individuals. There are conservatives and liberals in those camps. But now they have, you cannot limit the amount of money. It's called, if you like it, it's called anonymous free speech. If you don't like it, like me, it's called dark money. Because also, states have to pass laws to even make those huge contributions public record. That's not been passed here in Arizona. So not only can the corporate entities make massive amounts of contributions to independent expenditures that run most of the negative ads that you see on television and in social media, but they don't even have to report it. They run it through those 501c4s, these nonprofit entities, and they call themselves, the Good Government Committee of Arizona. And that they give massive millions of dollars in contributions. It's laundered through those 501c4s and then pushed into an independent expenditure campaign. Our system it's sick, in my opinion. This is the number one obstacle that I think our democracy is facing these days. And that's why the presidential race was so important, because whoever is elected president makes the Supreme Court decisions. And it's quite obvious now that we're going to have a Supreme Court for decades to come, probably, that will maintain that Citizens United decision, that corporations are people, and states can't stop corporate contributions, which Arizona had in their constitution until 2010. This is a recent phenomenon. Let me tell you about the state legislature. There's 90 state legislators. 80 of them run privately. 10 of them run with what is called clean elections, which is a publicly financed entity. 80 of the 90 run privately. Guess where 80% 80% of all their campaign contributions come from. They come from registered lobbyists that are representing clients at the Capitol, a lot of corporate clients. And by the way, in the last election, 90% of the dark money, the unreported contributions of the wealthy and the corporate, et cetera, benefited Republicans in the state of Arizona. In some states, Democrats got the benefit. But in Arizona, 90% of it benefits the Republican Party, the Republican candidates. And that's just the political reality. The Republicans run the show at the state capitol, and they have for a very long time. We have 11 statewide offices in Arizona: Governor, Secretary of State, AG, Superintendent of Public Instruction, Treasurer, Mine Inspector, and 5 corporation commissioners. 11 of them. All 11 are held by Republicans. Democrats don't have one lousy statewide office. And you saw how close in registration they were, within 3 or 4 points. But that's the reality. And when you look at the congressional races, 5 of the 9 are of the U.S. House seats are Republican. Both U.S. Senators, Flake and McCain, are Republicans. Our local legislature, or our state legislator in the House, 60 members, it's 35-25 Republicans. Look at the sentence below the pie chart. You realize how amazing that is? The state House has been Republican since 1966. Whoa. And when you go to the Senate, it's a little more even, but still 30 members, 17-13 Republican. And it's been Republican since 1993. One time it was a 15-15 tie. So really the only hope that the Democrats have had in recent times is a governor. When Napolitano was governor for 6 years, she was a balance. She vetoed a lot of legislation of the Republicans. So that was when they had to, guess what, come together and compromise on the state budget and negotiate a state budget. That was the only time you saw balance, when the governor, there was a Democratic governor, frankly, in place to balance the Republican legislature. The state budget is everything, folks. Every legislative session, and we're now in the closing weeks of another one, it's the most important thing the legislature and the governor do, because it reflects the priorities of the Republican legislative leadership and now the Republican governor. The Democrats really have no say. And it is the most impactful thing that the legislature does every single year. So very briefly, just to understand in a very simplistic term, what funds the budget? There's a typo, by the way, the gray area that says tax 5%, that is the corporate tax. We get our money from the individual income tax in Arizona and from the sales tax, and a very tiny amount from corporate income tax. Corporate income tax used to be much higher and the sales tax was lower. But the legislature has reduced the corporate taxes dramatically. And many people believe in another 6, 8 years, there won't be any corporate tax. We rely heavily to make up the difference on a sales tax, which economists will tell you is a bit volatile. As the economy goes up and down, it really impacts sales tax, and you can play havoc with your budget. I believe the only good thing about a sales tax is it's the only way you can scoop up some money from the winter visitors and tourists. But to rely heavily on a sales tax is a little dangerous, but we do. And where does the money go? Well, it looks complicated, it's not. 79% of your state budget goes to just 3 areas. The first is education, K through 12, 42%, universities, 7%. So 49% of our state budget goes to education. 19% goes to access, which is our Medicaid system, Arizona Healthcare Cost Containment System. It's where Obamacare runs through. And then DHS is the Department of Health Services, it gets a tiny amount. So 19% goes to the Medicaid system, healthcare, and then corrections, the prisons, get 11%. 79% of the state budget is education, the Medicaid system, and corrections. DES is the Department of Economic Security. That is basic welfare, which has continuously been cut in Arizona. And the Department of Child Safety, DCS, used to be CPS. It's 4%, so 9 total there for a safety net of welfare and child protective services. All the other areas of state government, if you added them all up, Department of Revenue, state land, water resources, environmental quality, go through all of them. They're only 11% of the budget. So when you hear people say, we gotta cut the state budget, what they're talking about is you gotta cut education, you gotta cut the Medicaid, indigent health care, and corrections never gets cut. Our budget right now is at $9.6 billion, that's with a B, 9.6. You know what it was about 9 years ago, before the recession? 9.6 billion. We're exactly where we were 9 years ago, and yet our state has continued to grow. Prison population's higher, the education, there's more K through 12 and university students, and there's a ton of more people on our indigent healthcare system. And yet our budget has not increased hardly at all, because major cuts were made in K through 12 and in welfare services and in the universities, so that we were able to have a balanced budget that's required by our state constitution. But here's the real reason why we've had cuts and not much expansion in the state budget. The Republicans, as you saw earlier, run the show. Many Republicans run for the legislature and for governor saying they're going to decrease your taxes. That's just a litmus test issue in that pup tent of the Republican Party. And we have reduced taxes in this state every single year since 1990, except 1 year, 2003. We have lost, remember the budget is $9.6 billion? We've lost $1.23 billion in revenue because of reduced taxes. But when you adjust it for inflation since 1990, $4 billion in lost revenue. Boy, where could that money have gone into K through 12 and the universities and into healthcare? We could have avoided those cuts. We could have stayed up with the growth of our state. We could have invested more into teacher salaries. We could have done a ton more. But the Republican Party would say, if they were here today, they would say, oh, wait a minute. Reducing taxes, the corporate income taxes in particular, benefits our economy. It allows corporations to hire more people, give more salary increases, and more people then would be paying other taxes and income tax and sales tax. And so we actually benefit tremendously by lowering the taxes. It's called the trickle-down theory, the Art Laffer economic theory that was created predominantly in the late 80s and early 90s. Folks, I've been waiting for 25 years for that trickle-down, and I haven't seen it yet. I just see lost revenue. Every time they lower the taxes, I don't see the revenues increasing over all this time. I'm still waiting. And our state, in my opinion, suffers tremendously because of that. That's the reality that I see with our financial system. The Arizona Tax Research Association is one of the most conservative economic organizations we have in the state. It's funded predominantly by corporations in Arizona. Don't ask me why, but I'm on the board of directors. I want to just show you the last 3 points in green. This is a really simplified reason why we got a world of hurt in our budget. We are one of the youngest states in the country, 9th, with regards to kids. They're more expensive to take care of. Education, K through 12, right? We're also one of the oldest states, 13th. When you get older, the healthcare needs, very expensive population to take care of. So we got these two populations, young and old, to take care of, and yet look at the 18 to 64. These are the folks that are working, supposedly, paying taxes and paying for the young and the old. Oh, and other things too, like transportation, infrastructure, and so forth. And yet we rank 49th. We don't have enough people working that are 18 to 64 in this state. Huge problem. And yet we made the decision, the Republican leadership did, to keep lowering taxes every single year since 1990. And we wonder why we have problems. Speaking of problems, I'm almost done. What is the number one problem facing the state of Arizona? When I ask that question, you've had too many margaritas, so I'm not going to expect you to reply. But when I ask that question, usually people shout out transportation. They shout out water. We're in the desert. They shout out air quality. They shout out K through 12 education. They shout out universities. Nope. The number one problem facing the state of Arizona, which is very seldom talked about by the politicians at the state capitol, because either they don't care, I shouldn't say that, or they don't know how to solve the problem. Number one problem is poverty. These numbers are chilling. When I talk about poverty, folks, it's the Census Bureau definition. If you are a head of a household of 4 people, and you make $24,100, you're not poor. You're not part of this. If you're a single person and you make $12,100, you're not poor. These are really poor people we're talking about. The average is 14.7% of our population. Here in Arizona, it's 17.4. That's bad. That's really bad. When you compare us to the western states, we're not in good shape at all, are we? But what is the fastest growing demographic group in our state? Latinos. By far. Do you realize that for the first time in the history of our state last year, in the K through 12 traditional schools, neighborhood schools that still 85% of our kids go to, for the first time in history, the majority of the kids were not white. They were minorities. And the overwhelming percentage of those were Latino. Unfortunately, the reality is that minorities make up a huge percentage of the low income, of the poor. Thus, you have the Latino poverty rate. We have 6.8 million in this state. 2.1 million and growing are Latinos. The poverty rate of 27.5% is unconscionable. And if we don't do something about it, this state is toast. Because the greatest predictor of education success, graduating from high school, going on and working for a college degree, the greatest predictor is not race, it's income level. Well, it just so happens that the worst income level is tied to the fastest growing group demographic in this state, Latinos. We have got to crack that problem, or we, down the road, in a very short time, will not have the trained workforce, and the good jobs will not come to Arizona, and our entire quality of life will lessen in this state. We all have a stake in this, and yet nobody really looks at these numbers and talks about it. Nobody makes it a political issue. What can you do about it? Well, other states are sinking their teeth into it. One of the big problems we have is that we have passed through the vote of the people years ago English-only laws that say you can only teach kids in K through 12 via English. And we have this English learning process where we'll use Latino kids, and if you have to spend 2, 3, 4 hours a day drilling them in English, you do so, because it's required. And you take them out of core subjects, math, science, etc. And you wonder why their test scores are poor in math and science. You can't really survive that way. California just decided, we're not going to do this any longer. And they're now going to teach the core subjects in Spanish, or the necessary subject. Still teaching English, but not as much of the day. Because the reality is, as you saw at the beginning of this presentation, not only millennials, but young kids as well, over 25% of them don't speak English at home. Why would you expect them to come to school and do well if you're only talking English to them? You got to change the attitude here. You've got to teach to the students. We've got to make them more successful in the core subjects so they graduate from high school and they go to college. You've got to think, in my opinion, outside the box. But it's really hard, once again, with regards to the attitude towards diversity in our society and in America here, it's hard to get people to think like that. If maps do more for you than numbers, there it is. Pathetic. Look where Arizona is. That high poverty rate goes right through the Deep South and picks up Kentucky. And there we are. And when is it ever going to change if we don't change the way we educate people, and if we don't provide tutoring services? And remember I told you how the Department of Economic Security, basic welfare, has shrunk in this state? The lifetime that a mother with a couple of kids can stay and get basic welfare in this state is 1 year. It's the lowest in the country. They're trying to pass legislation to make it 2 years. But they're putting a bunch of restrictions on of how to get, so you have to qualify. And so it's become a controversial bill at the Capitol. But the point is, when you start cutting that safety net, it doesn't help you fight poverty. It makes the situation worse. That's the political reality as I see it. And I just want to conclude by quoting Sandra Day O'Connor, Justice O'Connor. Quote, "Society at all levels has a need to work together to solve the many challenges facing our state and nation. It is possible for people to sit down together and engage in cooperative problem solving. That requires bringing together groups with divergent viewpoints." Unquote. The Millennial Council can be a great vehicle for cooperative problem solving, for bringing together divergent views, and providing balanced thinking for Arizona. And the fact that you're here at this kickoff event is wonderful. The future is you. It's not baby boomers, not us. It is you, but you got to engage. And the fact that you're here tonight and participating in this kickoff event, the Millennial Council is a great opportunity. They're going to bring in divergent views. You won't have to put up with just my analysis. You can hear a variety. My guess is they'll pick juicy issues and have debates and so forth. It's all going to be there for you. So please continue to support the council's activities, and we can make this state better. We've got to. Thank you very much.